Hello and welcome to our EGX panel on digital storytellers. We have a brilliant selection of panelists to speak to you today and to explore the unique strengths, opportunities and pitfalls of storytelling in modern video games. So we're going to be covering a lot, everything from a range of tools available to the interactive storyteller, to writing, gameplay as a narrative vehicle, use of audio, the impact of cinematography, and I'm sure some general hints and tips for upcoming designers too. So without further ado, panelists, let's introduce yourselves and throw some titles that you've worked on recently. Let's begin with whoever is appearing first on my video chat, and that is Alex.
Hello, morning, or whatever time it is in your neck of the woods. Yes, I'm Alex. I'm one of the co-directors at Polygon Treehouse, and we just released the modern adventure game Rookie, and prior to that I was an art director at PlayStation, working on some of the Killzone titles and stuff like that.
Xalavier.
Hi, my name is Xalavier Nelson Jr. I'm a narrative director working in games. You might know me from my work on Hypnospace Outlaw, We Are the Caretakers, an airport for aliens currently run by dogs, SkateBIRD, or any of the literally dozens of other games I've worked on over the years. Hello.
And last but not least, Goldie.
Hello, I'm Goldie. I'm from Melbourne in Australia, and I'm an art director on Wayward Strand. I've worked on a few small indie games, and I got to work on Florence, which was pretty cool. And I'm also the art director for the Free Play Independent Games Festival. My pronouns are she and her, in case anybody... Yeah.
Thank you. And fab. And I'm Mel Phillips. I'm head of studio at Silver Rain Games, where we create narratives to empower players. But none of which I'm allowed to talk about at the moment. So for today, I'm going to be hosting and leading us through this sort of epic journey into storytelling. So where to begin on this? We're really on trend at the moment because there was recently a really big Twitter thread from the wonderful Rhianna Pratchett on writing as a discipline within the games industry and how that's starting to really form and come to the forefront. And she quoted James Swallow as saying, "There are no maps for these territories," in that it's difficult to give specific sort of career journeys for those wanting to enter the industry at this moment in time. So to begin with, I thought it might be useful to run through each of your career journeys and how you ended up doing what you do now. So I'm going to start with you, Goldie, and then we'll move on if there's time for other people. So how did you get to this point?
I think there are so many different pathways in, for sure. I sort of feel in a way that I fell into it. There were a few choices along the way, but for me, I grew up, I had lots of older siblings, much older, about 11 or 12 years older than me. So I grew up reading things that I probably shouldn't be reading. Like some of my earliest ones were, things like Mad magazine, which kind of just destroyed my childhood, like innocence pretty quickly and got me into this like cynical take on the world. And then growing up, I got into American novelists, graphic novelists like Daniel Clowes, who kind of wrote about doldrum suburban America, but mixed with sort of weirdo oddball characters. And I really enjoyed cynical narratives set in real world. And if I went to university, I went to go and study fine art. I was always illustrating and interested in comics and the visual storytelling tools. And I went off to study fine art, and they didn't have anything digital, and I was working in Photoshop at that point. So I thought, okay, well, I'll go off and I'll go and do the games degree, because that's where I'll get the best digital art kind of education. And when I arrived in the games degree, narrative games were really only just starting to kind of bear their teeth a little bit. We had games like Fez had just come out, and so the indie thing was really about sort of, cool platformers, but mostly the study was still about like fighting monsters and robots and using guns. So I got to be an undergrad when I guess this like neo-realistic thing started to happen in games narrative. And I went on to, make a few little games that were about kind of either my life or the lives of sort of people who would be in my real world. And yeah, sorry if I went on a bit of a tangent, but I guess living in Melbourne, there's such a good creative indie arts scene for things like music and film that we've seen one kind of emerge for games, and that's been where I've done a lot of my work and a lot of my collaboration with like-minded people who are just using games as like as a new medium, like a new artistic medium to write like human stories. And then in terms of career path, it's just been collaborations, a lot of it in Melbourne.
It's really interesting. Xalavier, did you have a similar journey into the industry, or was it different?
Very different. I was a literal child and pretended to be an adult so I could get review copies of games and be a games journalist. From there, my career path was pretty intentional, which I'm very thankful for in hindsight. I knew that to stay in this industry, I need to figure out not just, do I want to get into games? Because that's so much of the focus. You want to get into games so much that you might end up getting stuck in a place where you don't want to be, or just unhappy from the get-go, even though you're technically in the industry. So I was kind of laser focused on finding what would keep me around for the duration of a career. I went from writing about games to writing for games, to becoming an adult, to looking more into narrative design and ways to bring together multiple pieces of a game and a game's design to communicate a narrative story. And then from there, I realized I didn't give a crap about touching every piece of the game. I just wanted to ship on time and on budget. Because, Lord, there's too much we need to do, and we're all going to die one day. So that's what led me to get into production and direction, and this really happy little place where I am now.
And Alex, what about you?
So I studied animation at university, and it was kind of quite a broad course. It was at the National Centre in the UK, and so there's people going into films and games from that. And basically, Sony Cambridge came and set one of our final year projects, and it was, showing my age here, but it was to create a PlayStation 2 spec character. So it was in, I think it was in like 2000 or something like that. And so I did that, and Tom, who was the other co-director at Polygon Treehouse, he did it as well. And we basically both got jobs off the back of it. So we started work at Sony Cambridge straight from uni. I was a junior character artist and animator. Tom went into environment stuff, and then basically stayed at Sony in its various guises, or that studio in its various guises for about 14 years, and learnt a lot in terms of like art, storytelling, like production, direction. So basically, when the studio unfortunately closed, I guess like 3 years-ish ago, so we decided to forge our own path and go indie. So I'm guessing, we made Rurky, which is very different from the games we've made in the past. It's kind of much more intimate and personal, and it's that people don't know much about it. It's basically an adventure game inspired by Scandinavian folklore. So it's this story of trolls and monsters, but it's kind of collided with the reality and this very human story of a broken family getting reforged. And so, guessing our approach, because we come from an art background, our approach does tend to be art-led in like how we make games and tell stories. But then we're very keen on and leveraging all the other disciplines as well. Like obviously writing is key, audio, cinematography. So we try and kind of have a real holistic approach. But yeah, our kind of in is definitely from the art side.
I always find it really interesting that I've never found sort of that career pathway into the games industry. It's never the same between any two people, and I think for me that's really healthy for our industry. That you don't have to have this university degree and this way in. Although maybe we do have a problem with gatekeepers, but we certainly have doors open round the back for those that want to go the sort of less traditional route into the games industry. I studied music, didn't work in games. My first job was a lowly project coordinator at BAFTA, that started to set up the BAFTA crew program and slowly worked my way up to being the head of the games program there at BAFTA for the last sort of 8 years. And then Abu Bakr Salim, my business partner, said, let's make a studio. And now that's what we do. So again, sort of a sort of weird way into the industry. But that for me is always comforting, because I think it means that, you know, we rely heavily on, can you do the job, rather than let me see your papers. And I like that. So here's something, this is a bit controversial to start off with. I often see a sort of meme going around on Twitter about narrative designers getting upset about the phrase that, you know, we're all storytellers. There's a story inside each of us. You just have to be able to have the opportunity to tell it. And my question is not to sort of diss on people that have, you know, I've got a really good game idea to show you, because I think we all get this. You all get people that go, oh, I've got a great game idea. I certainly have, you know, when I go home for family Christmas, aunts and uncles going, hey, listen to my idea about games. So with all these people that have ideas, what is it that differs narrative designers from people with just a cool idea? How do you move up and level up and take it to the next level?
I'd say make something. I think that's the kind of thing.
That's the only thing.
Yeah, because you only, like, an idea is an idea, and a lot of its stuff is in the execution, and especially in terms of narrative in games, like an interactive narrative, until you actually start laying down some of the structure and playing it and see how it feels. It's really, you know, it's really hard to tell. And actually, sometimes ideas, it's really important to have a strong vision, but ideas can like change and evolve and add nuance. Yeah, like it's just like narrative design like covers a lot of different areas depending on the genre of game you're making, because, you know, narrative designer is still really important in like an action game, in storytelling, as they are in like a more of a, what people would call it, you know, a story rich game that is very focused on the narrative. So narrative designers, you know, there's a broad school there, I guess. Yeah. Right.
I think you know, I'm not a writer. I'm much more personally interested in using visuals to tell the story, but I think Alex has got a good point in that. Of course, you know, one must start somewhere. If you're watching this and interested, you just have to start writing. But there are people who are so skilled with being narrative writers for games. Xalavier, I think, is one of them, and you know, you're thinking so much about like what the player inputs, controlling pacing, you know, how structured is your pacing, how much do you give to the player to just freely explore versus how much of it is linear. There's so many kind of different pathways that you can take as a writer that I would be very overwhelmed to start learning how to do it very, very well. I don't think there's a simple like, oh, that's how you do it, you know. That's my thought on it.
I think something really important to recognize for this specific question is that when you are a narrative designer, you aren't telling the team what to do. The two big differences between being a sort of ideas person, being like, you know, it should be like Grand Theft Auto plus Skyrim and don't make it bad, is a lot of awareness, a lot of responsibility, and a lot of flexibility. So a lot of awareness of the team and the overall environment, thinking about what is the art style, what are the constraints, as Goldie was pointing out, all of the different, the control inputs and how you can utilize those in themselves to tell a story. You have the responsibility of really nailing down what the game is. You can't just say it has a story. How is that story delivered? What are the chunks? What are the constraints? How do other people create things within the same foundations you've made? And really the flexibility, which is the sort of the peak, the peak danger and the peak thrill of being a narrative designer, is that the ground is constantly shifting beneath you. So you're told, hey, we were making Grand Theft Auto plus Skyrim, but it turns out people don't like Grand Theft Auto anymore. So now it's Skyrim plus Skyrim. And rethinking your entire approach, having the having the creativity to sort of give up one version of an idea to find a new one and the best path forward alongside an entire team. That's the heart of narrative design. And if you want to say things to people and have them just do what you say, then games in general might not be the medium for you.
Yeah, that's such a good point. If I might just jump in, like you say danger and I think opportunity, but then you keep speaking and I'm like, oh no, danger. That's right. Product, like being a producer is such an important part of it. That's, yeah.
I think some of the really interesting things that I find with the narrative design as well, there's obviously a perception of it is very linked to story and writing, which of course it is. But in some ways, some of the writing is not like actual writing. It's not like the dialogue you'll see in the game. There's like the writing, which is like the broader story, which is conveyed in different ways. Also with the narrative design as well, one of the things we found really fascinating is part of narrative design for us was like adding in breathing space into the game. So there's gaps there that allow the player to absorb and reflect. So I think there's some of the things that are kind of key to narrative design aren't necessarily the things that people may associate with it from the outside. So those kind of lulls in the game basically allow the game not to be really like story dense. So it's not like wall to wall story and you're being bombarded with it, allowing the player time to explore and things to kind of resonate with them and just sort of I guess like a lot of with music and storytelling, a lot of it is about contrast. And so you've got peaks and troughs and quiet moments and loud moments.
I think we're definitely seeing that. Like, we're a new studio, we're starting up, trying to figure out like what are we doing, who are we, and the thing that comes across the most is that everybody has creativity. To work in the games industry, producers, programmers, they're all creatives. Nobody is just sort of the workman, and the ideas that come forwards, I think, have been really surprising. And having that communication as a team, it's definitely a team building. You need narrative designers to sort of go, okay, let me just sort of wrangle that in and present that, as a script. But for us, it's definitely a team process when we talk about storytelling.
Yeah, huge.
So we're definitely starting to see sort of storytelling in games grow in power. I mean, Alex, you sort of joked about it's shooty stuff, and now we're starting to see more this sort of shift, and I think that comes from games like Life is Strange, the Telltale series, and more recently Last of Us or Red Dead. They really promote sort of narrative gameplay, this storytelling at the forefront of commercial games. But we're also starting to see a huge number of indie games exploring narrative as its main sort of mechanic. So Xalavier, I was wondering if you could speak more about the variety of narratives that you're starting to see in the games that you're making and in that scene.
Yeah, I've worked on over 40 games in the past 4 years, and the range of things that are being created, even in the same genre, even with similar project goals, is incredible, because every time you bring different people into a room, even for the exact same idea, the idea itself and how it's executed upon fundamentally changes. So when we're looking at the variety that we're getting now, one of the great things about working in narrative is really that your skill set can be applied to any type of game. You'll be doing different stuff. In The Last of Us, you might find yourself writing way more "it's a grenade" than in Roki. But those two game types and the types of narrative design you'll be doing for both are equally valid and deeply necessary to the wider experience. So the key for narrative in games is really, in terms of variety, is it's an infinite space. So the most useful thing you can do as a narrative designer, which I think we're already starting to touch on, especially I love how Goldie's input is emphasizing that. You as a narrative designer, knowing the production process of games, knowing how your work is going to impact 7 other departments is so essential. And creating constraints that help in conjunction with the rest of the team to help guide what you're doing and focus it down a path and make sure that you don't end up spending 7 years making a game if you haven't planned for it in advance.
This is really one of like the happiest mistakes to make when you're a young dev, though, because it's a lot of fun. Like, at least,
Yeah,
you've got to give the first mess up game that you make where you're just like, yeah, this and that, and you throw production out the window. It's like it's a horrible process at the end of 8 years, but it was fun. Just putting that out there, right?
It's lovely and terrifying that, like, yeah, the games I made early in my career, I would never ever try to do that now, which means that those things wouldn't have existed if I had known better.
Sure,
it's worth it.
Yeah, I think some lessons you have to like. You can get all the advice you can and like read as many articles or talk to people or like look at talks like this, but sometimes you have to like make your own mistakes. There's the thing of like, you know, sometimes you have to try something and like trial by fire. I'm guessing like for narrative stuff, and one of the things that we were keen to do and something that was important to us, like, so in a lot of my time at Sony, I worked on some games like this game called Ghost Hunter 24, the game, the Jack Bauer game. I worked on that, and it looked like the Killzone stuff. And actually, the Killzone stuff was pretty good, but I think in some of those early games, especially on 24, because I was working in animation and like cutscene side, we spent so much effort in these linear cutscenes. It's like movies.
Realistic.
And, you know, multi-panels, and they were all quite nice, but people just skip them because actually people don't want to really experience. I mean, it's probably speaking from my own biased opinion, people don't really want to experience narrative like that. And again, they want to play the game. So I think that's the kind of, that was basically a big kind of learning experience for me, is actually like, I don't want to make games with narrative like that, where it's like big old cutscene, bit of gameplay, big old cutscene, because most of the time there's a lot of, from a production point of view, huge amount of time put into some of those kind of canned cutscenes, and most of the time people want to skip it. So the thing that I find really exciting and really powerful is, and what we've tried to do is basically when you're telling the narrative and the story through the gameplay. I think for me that's where the magic is in telling stories in games and stuff. Like, I guess like games that I've really enjoyed in the past, like Ico, the Brothers, Tales of Two Sons. That just, you know, you're and some of them don't even have dialogue, right? And it's still a story, still a very powerful story. So yeah, I think and it's really exciting to see what new people are doing in that space as well.
I mean, that's really the opportunity that we have as people interested in game development, or as people who hang out with game developers or are game developers, is that we kind of saw narrative in games. Like, it started off, I think, with like a really strong indie kind of like queer vibe. A lot of queer artists were using interesting narrative stuff in games, and then that developed and more people adopted it and started looking at it, and now the community got stronger, and now I think we're starting to see like programmer types and people interested in like game mechanics design go, okay, well, how can I marry like games mechanics design to this like really cool new novel way of putting like worlds and stories and people and narrative. Like, how can I marry those interestingly? What can I design to deliver the narrative in a way which is unique to games, in a way that's inspired by film and inspired by novels and inspired, but which is interactive.
What do you think of
that's just like this incredibly exciting like design moment, right? We haven't had that before.
What do you think of the term narrative radiation, almost, for in terms of like what we create as digital interactive storytellers? When you get outside of the linear cutscenes, the fact that even in a game where your primary play experience is something totally different, the context that's surrounding it is imbued with narrative to the point that it becomes something greater than the sum of its parts.
I think I know what you mean. So, like, I guess I've heard the term narrative soup before. I don't know if that's the same thing. Where basically
no.
So I'm guessing you're saying like in a game like an action adventure game, the fact that the world itself is so story rich that actually the player is projecting meaning onto the actions that they're doing because there's so much world building in the world. Those that I'm a big fan of the From Software games, and I really like that kind of the storytelling in those things. Basically, you're that stuff could all be absent, and people would still enjoy it as like a fairly hardcore exploration and fighting game. But the fact that it kind of drops you in the world and doesn't really tell you anything about it, and you're gradually building up this idea of this story, and it all feels very mysterious, and you're peeling back the layers. Yeah, I find that stuff quite exciting because it adds to the feeling of going into the unknown and like uncovering this thing. And it may be that I think because you're doesn't really, like, when you make a connection between two different story bits, even though like very implied, it feels like quite a powerful aha moment. And I think and the fact that it's doesn't feel like a fully fleshed out didactic story that's like really explicit, that makes it all the more mysterious and more of a more powerful narrative experience for me. I don't know if I went wide of the mark or if that's.
That's what I want to know too.
So I was going to sort of bring this into our next question, actually, which is about world building. But we're in this really exciting time as well, where sort of next gen consoles are on their way and new technologies coming. So in terms of the future of storytelling, does that change things? With this sort of, we're seeing it more as a power and as an industry in its own right, but with new technology, and Goldie, you touched briefly on sort of film and cinematics there, sort of bleeding into the game sphere. So what does that mean for games?
I don't know. I kind of feel like, this whole thing's a dog and we've just taken the leash off and let it run in the park. And that's a beautiful thing. And I'm not in control of what people are going to do with it. But I'm a bit of a history, I think very much in history, like terms of a timeline of how the world is going. And if you look at like the history of video games, I think the last sort of 10 years, the evolution of how we look at narrative and the respect we give to it will make huge differences to the future of games. Absolutely, it must, because it's resonant and it is fascinating, and it really helps to, as I said, push games to the next like exciting phase of its life, in my opinion. And then there are going to be people who are like, no, what pushes games forward is like realism in graphics, and that's cool. Like people can be interested in that, but I think the dog off a leash thing is really how I feel about it. I think that people have so much access now to thinking about this. Only 5-6 years ago, thinking about interesting ways to incorporate narrative was kind of really indie, like fringe indie. Like people weren't thinking about it too much. Not most people. Certainly not companies like. Well, I was going to say Rockstar, but I think they're actually really good at it. But yeah, I digress. I don't know. I just think that it's good. It's positive and it's exciting. But I can't say for sure what's going to happen. It depends. There's always kids graduating. Like there's always new people arriving to make their mark and to make the thing that they've been planning to make since they were 10. And if it's like a healthier and happier community and a safe space for everybody, and more people are welcome and more diverse voices are here to tell their stories, like bring it on. Like I just think it's going to be great. Yeah.
And so about sort of oh gosh, I'm pulling everything around. In regards to world building, Alex, you picked up on sort of, it's wider than the narrative, this sort of archaeological storytelling. Can you tell us a bit more about what that is and what that means, specifically as well for Roki, and how you came about with the design?
Yeah, well, so I guess for what we tried to do is to allow, we kind of drop the player in the world, and we basically try and have as little exposition as possible, where we're like sitting you down and telling you the story, because we, I think used frugally it's fine, but when it's kind of overdone, it's like, it just feels like there's the story and then there's the game, and there's quite a separation there. Whereas do you want them to kind of be like intertwined? And so what we try and do is, we find it like quite a powerful thing. Tuve, the main character in Roki, she'll run around the forest and she'll find different things, and we'll plant little story seeds Like, so that she'll go and look at something. It's like, oh, there's this, and it's an abandoned cabin. It's covered in the snow, and so it's almost like the storytelling there is. It's not just a location you can explore. It's just, it's the start of a story thread, even though it's a visual. It's a visual thing. It's like, well, why? So you're basically planting these questions. Why is there a cabin in this forest that's covered in snow? Why was there a carpenter inside it? Why was he whittling a cradle? And then we have a big one of the things that was nice in in the demo that we had. There's a big graveyard, and people can go around and examine the gravestones and what's written on them. And that's actually part of a much wider kind of story thread. But when you initially get to the location and explore it, well, what's happened here? What's happened to all these people? Why have so many people gone missing, or children have been spirited away?
Incidental storytelling, like storytelling that is there that you can kind of pick up on the side.
Yeah, I think it is. It's in each individual instance. It is incidental. I guess it's just like the kind of the layering up of all that stuff. 'Cause I think that is probably we do have like some more cutscenes, or they do tend to be more interactive. Like we have these kind of interstitial things where it'll start off with a cutscene, but then it'll kind of evolve into very simple gameplay. But a lot of our storytelling is that layering up of incidental stuff to build up a picture. And I think the difference there is that the player is an active agent in the story. So rather than being told stuff, they're unearthing it themselves. And a lot of this stuff we have learned as we've been going, because we did things where we thought, it'd be cool if when Tuve runs into a new area, she runs into a courtyard, and she goes, oh, it's a new area, and I can see this, and she'd say some stuff about what she'd seen. But actually, that wasn't you doing that as the player. That was her then, telling that to you. And so we actually found that it was much better to have the player go in, and then actually they'd explore for themselves, and they'd go, and that felt like a much the player was in charge in a much nicer way to be telling a story. It was quite a subtle difference, because actually you're still getting the same information, but one is like you're telling the player, and one is the player has the power to tell that story for themselves. But yeah, and we also I think that's the kind of thing I think about with narrative stuff and design, is like looking at a game and seeing all the different opportunities for storytelling within it. It's like and some of that will be in music, some of that will be in lighting, some of that will be in cinematography, and but it's about finding those opportunities and trying to make them as powerful as possible. So we try and do quite a bit with in-game cinematography. We have quite predatory cameras that feel like they're watching you all the time from the undergrowth, and we also have a journal, which is and this the kind of thing, some things you'll need for the game design of making sure that the puzzles are guided and there's safety nets there in case people get stuck. But then also you can go, oh, actually, we need this, and we need a map so the player can locate themselves in the world when it gets quite big. But then you go, oh, there's an opportunity here, as a storytelling opportunity, that actually we can put down Tuve's inner thoughts as she's finding new locations. And actually it provides it's not just extra fluff, it provides a different insight into what she's thinking, because it's not the stuff she'll verbalize externally, it's more her kind of vulnerable thoughts to herself and her fears. So actually you go, well, from this thing that's we need to make sure that people don't get lost in the forest, or we need to make sure that if someone gets stumped at a puzzle, there's some guidance there. It's going, oh, actually there's a really powerful narrative thing here. I know I've blathered on too long on that point, but you get the idea.
I was going to pick up on something Goldie said earlier, which was about telling real life stories. And how does that differ really? And what sort of what considerations, I guess, does narrative have to take when bringing about real world stories into games?
I just want to quickly mention that, for us with Wayward Strand, oh gosh, all of our characters are really, really old. Most of our characters are really, really old. So that's been just this trove of writing these histories made up of a combination, smashing together all of our grandparents' histories and the histories of people in our communities. But I was going to say consultation is my number one answer. It's to consult where it's not your story to tell, or, diversify your writing group if you have any need to and do it quickly. That's my number one answer to that. It's like be responsible, you know.
But in more detail, sort of what responsibilities, I guess, do we have as game designers to players?
I mean, we could talk for a very long time about ethical storytelling.
Yes.
But if I can just chime in on this question, I think there's something really important to be said for ethics starts on a team level. So as Goldie mentioned, even if you bring to a standard gruff military man shooter a more diverse group behind the scenes, they're going to pull out different things in that scenario than what you've seen before. When you have, as part of your pillars for a title, treating subject material ethically and with nuance, or bringing on consultants, that propagates throughout the entire game development process. So really, as much as we can talk about ways to execute ethically, so much of it just starts with the way you make up and lead and set the direction for a team.
Which goes on to influence the entire industry and therefore, like, hopefully our culture.
Can you talk about how you did that for Wayward Strand?
Yeah, I mean, we consulted with the Bunurong Lands Council down here. So Australia has I think like one of the longest Indigenous histories on the planet, which is extremely cool. And Australia was broken up into like probably hundreds, I'd say, of nations. And where we've set Wayward Strand is down on the southern coast near where we are in Melbourne. And so we got in touch with the Lands Council down there and have had quite a lot of meetings now with them talking about Wayward Strand. And just because Wayward Strand is like full of like literally probably getting up to thousands of little stories now because of the mechanics of it. We have an Indigenous character on the ship, and we wanted to like ask for their recollections of that area in the 70s, because none of us were alive in the 70s, and we were doing this with everybody who we were speaking to down there. But having an Indigenous consultation like relationship there was really fascinating. And not only did I personally like learn a lot about the place that I live, but the character is so much sort of honestly richer and more interesting, and has a lot more to say that I wouldn't have considered. And the way that he answers questions now, and the sort of what drives him is based in reality, and that's, to me as an artist, better. So that was like the main point of consultation for diversity. But we've also been able to do consultation with like a lot of older people, like really old people, not only to kind of ask them about the 70s. So we've spoken to a lot of nurses who were nursing in the 70s. The game Wayward Strand is set in a hospital in the 70s. But also just to listen to old people talk to us and pick up on Australian mannerisms and cues. What else have we done? We consult everywhere. We've consulted with architects, obviously. We're turning a floating ship into a hospital. But for narrative, for me, the most interesting relationship that I've been like lucky enough to kind of be there for was with the Land Council, for sure. And they're really happy to, like, they love, that we reached out, and we are always telling other devs that, it's just a phone call or an email, and it improves the situation.
So my studio, Silver Rain Games, does particularly well at like attracting diverse hires, because it's interesting that you mentioned about diversity there and how that maybe affects the industry itself, making games about diverse content. So Abu and I often credit the fact that we attract these more diverse hires for the fact that we are a woman and a black man leading a studio. Like, representation seems to matter in that case. just sort of organically attracting more diverse hires to us. But I'm keen to hear from the team as well in terms of what are your thoughts on welcoming more diversity into the area of games, and how do we combat that? Is it just a case of putting out more diverse stories, or can we do better?
Learn how to build guillotines.
Eat the rich.
Number one.
I think that obviously the more prominent visual people that are in the industry, so people who are aspiring game developers can look at interviews and media and and go, oh, there are people like me working in games. I can there is the possibilities there. I think the kind of the more, I wouldn't say the easier it becomes to make games, maybe the more accessible. There's less barriers. Obviously, there still are barriers to entry, but less than there were 10 years ago, and more people making more diverse games over time. That will help. And I think there definitely is a responsibility for creators to be making their teams more diverse, and if they're trying to tell a certain story, getting people involved like really early on as a kind of intrinsic parts of the team to lay the kind of foundations for that. I think that is the responsibility of of the creators. I
think it's easy to become the champion, I think. So both Abu and I feel that, I get asked a lot to speak on, what is it like to be a woman in the games industry? And it's like, I don't know. It's like,
I don't know exactly.
I've only been this. So I can only tell you from my own experiences, which are, as we know, completely diverse in terms of everybody's journey into the games industry anyway. So, me telling you how to be a woman doesn't help you get a job in the games industry. Xalavier, do you get asked a lot on, diversity questions? Because I'm going to come to you now with like, how do we increase diversity? And it's not, because I get annoyed about the same thing. Like, how do we get more women? I'm like, I'm not the champion for women, but I guess my existence helps.
Yeah, there's several components to this. I think one really valuable thing that y'all did touch on is visible people and people in leadership from diverse perspectives does change things massively. If you've got one person of color on your team, when I'm looking at sort of your team photo, it makes it, and that's the only person in like a sea of white. It makes a difference if that person is a junior artist or if they're a lead or direction level developer, because I know with that knowledge to what level their experience is being utilized and respected within that studio. There's also, to be frank, the component of if you are the one person within a studio, you see an exponential downward, unless there are specific safeguards in place to prevent this. If you are the one diverse person in a studio, or you're the one person being called upon for the diversity questions, there's an exponential downward effect to how much you can do. Because if you raise, hey, the way we're treating this character, this group, or this representation, specifically in this instance, is off, and you are the only voice saying that, your voice can get tuned out, you can get fired, you can become the nagger, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It doesn't fix things to have one person from a diverse perspective or a marginalized perspective on your team. To have an effective upswelling of a voice, you need more than that. And I know, especially for small teams, that can be hard to find. But in terms of, this is where, as Goldie mentioned, you can have things like consultation or simply creating places for that voice, for those voices to be respected and to be heard often and early, is so essential. Because otherwise you are creating a place where your diverse people are putting your diverse and marginalized developers are putting themselves in a dangerous place to give you the information you need to make your game better.
Yeah. So wild.
Yeah. I mean, we're a studio of almost 50% women, and it's unlike anywhere that I've ever worked before. And if somebody told me like, oh, diversity matters, I didn't realize the effect that it would have on our work practices, how we communicate. It's insane how how different it is by being in that sort of work stream. And only just, and I mean, that sounds, I'm so embarrassed to even have only just realized, yeah, of course it makes a difference. But didn't realize how much it sort of infiltrated every level of development just by having that diversity. And that kind of brings me on to my final question, which is, what resources do you think are missing for new designers to enter into this storytelling space? And that includes diversity, but that could include anything else, you know, sort of what are we missing? How do we support the next generation to bring them into our space?
I think the biggest piece that's missing is a really delicate piece, really, really delicate, because there are going to be scoundrels out there who want to cash in on this, who have intentions which aren't focused on the art of writing for games and more focused on the money and influence. But I think the biggest piece missing is the kind of relationship between video game development and the old and flawed kind of like arts world. So, you know, I would love to be able to walk into my local library and have them say, oh yeah, here's a video game section where you can sit and peruse like the history of games. And I would love for, you know, places like museums to have more of an interest in it. And the kind of breaking away from where games are sort of settled into is this like really nerdy masculine thing. And I think narrative can kind of like hold its hand and pull it and say, here's games and here's the new games. And so the biggest piece for me is just like not something that really any of us can influence individually. It's sort of just like a slow cultural process of reframing where games sit as a piece of media in the real world. It'll take a long time.
I think for me, when you look at like funding for games, it's like a big part, and then there's like various different seed funding, which is popping up now. Because I guess there's a challenge there that if you want to make, obviously you can make something in your spare time to try and like, you know, and your wings and explore what kind of games you want to make, and you can make. I guess the really cool thing about narrative is that you can tell an epic story with not very much budget. You can imply a lot of stuff if you kind of work smart. So there are opportunities to tell whatever stories you want, but in a kind of quite a contained way. But I think you look at kind of like funding as a key thing, and how do we get people accessibility to funding. I know there's various different funds starting to pop up to encourage different people to get into games, and there's a kind of springboard to propel them there. So that's quite exciting to see.
I think the number one piece for this process is an increasing literacy with what the actual workflow of the medium is, what it's actually like to be here, what's actually like to make games. Because before I was a games writer, I didn't realize that you had to define how large a text box is, and how large a text box is or where text is displayed has consequences on the rest of the game. Whether you have text boxes at all, maybe you don't have a background for your subtitles. How does that change the types of visuals you can have? Alex knows what I'm talking about. I was a narrative director before I knew what a collider was. Mm-hmm. I hadn't worked on the back end. And for those who aren't familiar, a collider is the little green hell boxes that all of your video games are made out of. If you can walk into a wall and not go through it, that is a collider. When you are walking, it's along a surface, that is a collider. In a 3D world, everything is colliders. I see these invisible gremlins behind every screen. I'm ruined for playing any game now. But that fundamental knowledge that everything in a game is essentially either matching the shape of the object itself, or it's a sphere, a capsule, or a box. That's it. That
don't tell them.
that dramatically changes the way you approach a world. It shows you on a fundamental level what are the building blocks of these experiences that we're building. And if you don't know those coming in, if you're constantly running into this barrage of new information, yes, that's thrilling. But it also means you don't have the perspective to honestly start to build up the higher level skills that would allow you to meaningfully contribute to games on places beyond the junior level coming into your first job.
Yeah. I think marrying the three of those, like connecting the three answers to that question, Mel, is like the ultimate answer. Having, you know, education for young game developers, whether they're artists or narrative designers or music people, and saying, okay, well, let's do a little bit of like game development education paired with, you know, the arts world and history, kind of like taking a new lens on what games are, paired with like funding opportunities that will come from that and go to people who are educated and be able to make these things. That would be, I'd like
the dream.
the dream. Yeah.
Amazing. Sorry, did you want to add anything?
No, we're probably running out of time a little bit. The only thing I was going to add was for anyone creating anything, I think one of the really important things for me, and was always pushed upon us, was to have like a really diverse frame of reference and influences. I think that's the kind of thing, if you are looking to get in games, don't just play big AAA games, like play all the little weird games, watch world cinema, reading books.
Dogs in airports.
Yeah, and that's the kind of thing. Like if you wanted to write a fantasy book about wizards and you just consumed fantasy books about wizards, your fantasy book about wizards may be slightly generic.
Yeah.
So, you know,
but if you were really into surfing, like you might be the person who writes that great wizard surfing novel. You know,
exactly. I'm waiting.
Goldie, please make a wizard surfing novel. Come on, you can't just tease that.
I'm under NDA.
Trademark that name. Made a note.
Yeah, and on that NDA, we will end. Thank you so much. You've been an absolutely fantastic panel. You can hear my dogs now, I don't know, in the background going downstairs because I've left them. But again, thank you so much for your expertise and knowledge. A final chance, I think, for everyone to just give a little plug for what they're working on now, or to direct people to Twitter or websites. I'll go through again how you appear on my screen. So, Alex.
On Twitter, I'm at Kanaritron, and our studio is at Polygon Treehouse, and we've just made Rookie out now on Steam and GOG, and coming soon to Switch.
Am I next, or is it
Xalavier? Yeah, it's cases like this.
Hello. You can follow me on Twitter at Rit Nelson, WRIT Nelson. I'm working on a lot of things all the time, and I do bad puns there. Feel free to wishlist SkateBIRD or An Airport for Aliens, currently run by dogs, on Steam right now.
And Goldie.
Cool. Yeah, you can follow me at Ghost Town Goldie. You can follow my game at Wayward Strand, and it's also Steam wishlist season on that, so check that out, and also check out the Free Play Independent Games Festival if you haven't before. That's a really groovy place to watch lots of talks like this that have the artistic bent on them. Yeah,
thank you. And you can find me at Lil Miss Phillips or at Silver Rain Games on Twitter. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mel.
I've had a really lovely morning. It's very early here, so this has been a lovely start to my day, so thank you very much. Bye.
See ya.
Bye, folks.